Thank you so much for joining us and welcome to our discussion, Funding from a Place of Trust. Today's discussion marks the launch of Synergos' new report commissioned by Citi Foundation that explores the value of general operating support and capacity building grants. My name is Marina Pudre from the Synergos Institute, and I will be going over a few housekeeping rules before handing it off to our lovely moderator for today, Swati Chaudhary, Director of the Advisory Group here at Synergos.
Thank you, Marina. Hi, everybody. Welcome to a virtual session on funding from a place of trust. My name is Swati Chaudhary. I'm the Director of Synergos Advisory, a social impact advisory practice within Synergos Institute. We offer strategic counsel and research to foundations, philanthropists, and companies. I will be your host today and guide us through the session. Our discussion today builds on a namesake report called Funding from a Place of Trust, exploring the value of general operating support and capacity building grants. The report is commissioned by Citi Foundation and authored by Synergos. It was launched this week, and if you haven't seen it already, we will be sharing it in a follow-up email after this session. Meanwhile, during the discussion, we will hear opening remarks from Citi Foundation, followed by brief highlights from one of the co-authors of the report, and finally, a panel discussion with a mix of funders and nonprofits. Our panelists come from Organization for Community Development, OCODE, a grassroots organization supporting communities in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, from Wakam Community Foundation, from Wakam County in Washington State in the US. Please welcome Global Fund for Children, a grant-making organization with an international footprint. And finally, Career Ready, which works in the UK to connect youth from disadvantaged communities to the world of work. Folks, this session aims to explore non-programmatic funding in the form of general operating support, capacity building grants, and overall flexible funding. We will discuss its role in some of the critical things that social impact sector is called upon to deliver, such as innovation, collaboration, learning and measurement, adjusting to the changing needs of our communities, and of course, responding to a crisis. It's both a timely and a lasting topic. And our conversation aims to dig beneath the surface of COVID timeline and tug at enduring undercurrents, such as measuring impact, effectively supporting grassroots organizations, the power dynamics of grant making and grant seeking, and the structure of philanthropy organizations. So let's get started. And to kick us off, allow me to invite Florencia Spangaro, Director of Programs at Citi Foundation, to open up the discussion. Go ahead, Florencia.
Thank you, Swati. And I want to join Swati in welcoming all of you and thanking you for joining today's webinar. Like many funders, we at the Citi Foundation have been evolving our approach to flexible funding over the years. 10 years ago, we created a new way to fund capacity building programming internationally. About 4 years ago, we launched a US program that has been providing more than $40 million in unrestricted grant making across the country. But throughout this journey, what we felt has always been very valuable to us is to listen and to learn. We definitely don't claim to have all the answers. And that's why we commissioned this report and today, Funding from a Place of Trust. It goes without saying that we find ourselves in one of the most pivotal learning moments we may ever experience in a lifetime. We are in the position to see even more clearly how flexible funding can be fundamental. Like many of you, we have been adapting our policies and funding strategies because of the crisis, providing more flexibility across our grant-making operations globally. Yet, I'm left with a sense of regret. What if we had invested more of our funding in core support over the years? Would the organizations fighting today to be in a better position to respond in face of this crisis? What I can say with certainty is that we have an opportunity, and perhaps I would say even a responsibility, to create a new normal. And for us at the Foundation, this report is really helping shape our thinking. For example, we're thinking through how to ensure that the flexibility that we made possible because of COVID-19 are changes that we can then institutionalize in the long run. We're thinking through how to ensure that this new normal, one which I hope you agree with us, is one where trust and partnership and flexibility can be center stage, not only during a crisis, but more importantly, or as importantly, in the longer term. With that, I really want to thank Cernagos for their partnership over the last year on this report. I also want to thank my colleague Dorothy, who led the project on the Citi Foundation side. But more importantly, I want to thank our esteemed panelists for their insights and this conversation today. So with that, I'm really looking forward to listening in and learning more. And let me turn the floor over back to Swati.
Thank you, Florencia. For our next segment, allow me to invite my Synergos colleague, Fern Mele, one of the co-authors of this report, to share highlights and key findings from the report.
Thank you, Swati. The report is a result of research looking at general operating support and capacity building grants for nonprofits. And we asked the question, how do these kinds of funding add value, and how do they enable changes within nonprofits that ultimately drive results at the community level? The purpose of this work is to contribute to the discussion, to think about general operating support and capacity building grants more deeply, as Florencia was mentioning, especially at this critical time. There's more and more consensus on the importance of flexible funding, but still not enough donors are prepared or comfortable extending it. As we have heard, this global pandemic throws a new and urgent spotlight on this topic and on the importance and indeed the necessity of flexible funding, not just as an emergency response that is happening a lot now, but as a core way of funding. We need strong community-based organizations that are not just implementers of programs, but are an integral part of the infrastructure and are able to pivot when necessary, as in a crisis or when an opportunity emerges, to keep serving the community. And general operating support and capacity building grants play a key role, as we will hear. Just to get the definitions out of the way, by general operating support, I mean, of course, unrestricted funding that is fully flexible, doesn't have limitations on time or use. Capacity building grants, on the other hand, are used to strengthen the overall organizational health of a grantee, their investments in skills, capabilities, and systems, etc. The key insights in the report are drawn from conversations with more than 60 among donors, intermediaries, and community-based organizations. The core of the report are 4 profiles of organizations, including the perspectives of some of the grantees. These profiles explore the role that general operating support and capacity building grants play in the dynamics of donor-grantee relationships, the value that they bring, and the changes, both tangible and intangible, that happen within a nonprofit and that drive results. These organizations have different institutional structures, and they're illustrative of the range of players that we find in the field of development and philanthropy today. So we have the Firelight Foundation, which works in Eastern and Southern Africa, serving children and youth. And we have 2 grantee partners of Firelight featured in the report, the Namwera AIDS Coordinating Committee in Malawi and the Organization for Community Development in Tanzania. We have Whatcom Community Foundation operating in a county of the United States that has a population of about 220,000. And the report features 2 of their grantee partners, Bellingham Food Bank, which focuses on food security, and Sustainable Connection, working on economic opportunity. The Global Fund for Children is an international NGO that works with 120 grantee partners around the world. 2 of these partners are featured in the report. They are ARPAN, which fights child sexual abuse in India, and Asociación Pop Noj, which empowers youth, women, and immigrant children from indigenous communities in Guatemala. Finally, Career Ready is a nonprofit, as you heard, based in the United Kingdom that connects youth with the world of work, working with schools and teachers across the country. We really appreciate the time and the knowledge and the experience that these organizations have shared with us. 4 of them are represented on the panel today, and other leaders are joining us in the audience. So again, thank you for your contribution to the report and the learnings. So we have a small cross-section of organizations working locally, nationally, regionally, globally, all of them focused ultimately on bringing positive social and economic change to communities. Despite these different ways of operating, different geographic scope and sectors, the key themes from the report resonate widely across these organizations. And I'll spend a few minutes on these insights before we go to the panel discussion. A key insight that is woven through the research and the conversations we had and is reflected in the title of the report is this notion that flexible funding can really be seen as a form of trust capital. Funding from a place of trust indicates that the initial emphasis comes from the giver. The organization that writes the checks, by choosing to provide flexible funding, gives up some control and signals the intention to work in a more equal partnership. And there's a tension between trust and outcomes, right? Because by definition, to trust means to give confidence, to make a leap of faith, surely informed by due diligence, but to choose to accept uncertainty to an extent, including about the outcomes. So there can be a tension at the outset between the desire to define and predict results, which might drive a donor, and operating based on trust. Trust, of course, is not born in a vacuum, and it is earned over time. So it's important to have a long-term commitment to flexible funding. Investing early and for the long haul is a good way to build a relationship that gives a grantee a sense of stability and the ability to focus on what the community needs, and then have those needs in turn drive the interventions. When nonprofit leaders have the confidence to make decisions about the use of funds, we find that this really creates a level playing field. It helps overcome a deficit mindset and serves as a license to innovate. The role of the donor can then become that of a thinking partner, and in the process, learning and capacity begin to build and flow both ways. Flexible funding can also help create a more level playing field between smaller and larger NGOs, where the smaller NGOs may not always have the access, the resources, the voice that the larger ones have. There's somewhat of a gold standard, we heard, in the combination of flexible funding that is long-term and capacity building grants. This combination of funding allows an organization to build skills and not have to trade off between capacity, programmatic growth, and the capacity to innovate. The presence of flexible funding, even in a small amount compared to programmatic restricted funding, can ensure that new capacity that is acquired is sustained over time. And we'll hear from some of the organizations on how they have benefited from this combination of capacity building grants and general operating support. Like I said, the funding doesn't have to be large to have an outsized beneficial impact. The notion of grantee readiness is also important. General operating support and capacity building grants can contribute to this readiness in terms of making an organization able to use these funds to better fulfill mission and impact. But readiness is not just about skills and competencies. It also has to do with a mindset of pursuing impact goals rather than project goals. And organizations that rely heavily on restricted programmatic funding can find themselves somewhat trapped by having to think in terms of project goals, rather than having that latitude of being able to define what success is and what impact means for them and their community. 3 of the organizations profiled in the report are intermediaries of funding, and as such, they are both grantees and donors and have the perspective on general operating support and capacity building grants from this dual angle. When restricted funds flow through intermediaries, the restrictions are passed on to grantee partners. So these intermediaries can be strong advocates for flexible funding because they know the advantages firsthand, and they can amplify the voice of community-based organizations. We also find that when flexible funding flows through intermediaries, you can create a chain of trust that reaches from the original donor all the way to the community level. And it's difficult to trace the impact of capacity building grants and general operating support on the ultimate results. The flexibility of general operating support does not lend itself to creating baselines and timelines for measurement. And we found very little hard evidence of how capacity building grants drive ultimate impact. So it's challenging to trace this causality in a linear way. There are some interesting methodologies, though, that are emerging, and one of them is featured in the report. It's called outcome harvesting, and it's a collaborative process between donor and grantee, where the grantee defines success and looks at the outcomes and then traces back the causality of what led to those outcomes. And while it's difficult to trace how capacity building grants and general operating support impact results, this kind of funding can certainly play a key role in strengthening monitoring, evaluation, and learning systems, MEL for short. These systems usually require a large investment. Social outcomes are more difficult to measure than business outcomes. They can take a long time beyond the period of many grants. Yet, the burden is too often on nonprofits to provide evidence of results when they may be lacking the resources and the capacity to run a really strong MEL system. MEL investments are less useful when linked to a specific grant or project, and more useful when set up to provide data and learnings that inform the strategy. Donors can support grantees in designing an MEL system that serves the purposes of that grantee and of their community. So in sum, for organizations that are on the ground making a difference, the value of flexible funding and capacity building grants cannot be overstated. Funding from a place of trust is a practice that shifts decision-making closer to the community. It helps ensure that interventions are community-driven rather than donor-driven, and it helps to build stability, foster learning, and creates the conditions for a nonprofit to innovate, to pivot in a crisis, to respond to opportunities. And to do so not just as an implementer of programs or an organization called on to fill gaps, but as an equal partner and an integral part of the infrastructure. And now I'm going to go back to Swati so that we can hear directly from our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Fern. And now let's move to the panel discussion. Allow me to welcome our esteemed panelists. We have Joseph Jackson, who joins us from Tanzania. He's the Director of Programs at Organization for Community Development, acronymed OCODE. OCODE supports education for children, improved community livelihood, and youth empowerment. We have Maury Ingram, President and CEO of Whatcom Community Foundation, a grant-making as well as a fundraising organization that supports people, projects, and initiatives in Whatcom County in Washington State in the US. Please welcome Corey Ozer, Vice President of Programs at Global Fund for Children. This grant-making organization partners with local organizations around the world for children and youth to reach their full potential. And Mike Smith from Career Ready, a nonprofit that works in the UK to connect youth from disadvantaged communities to the world of work. Panelists, I've had the pleasure of speaking with each of you individually, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to this forum. Our audience today is a mix of institutional funders, individual philanthropists, international and grassroots civil society organizations, and just concerned members of our society. Our hope is that your insights can spark ways for our audience to take action in their organizations, in their work. So I'm excited to bring to light just even some of the important nuggets that you've shared with me previously. Meanwhile, audience, do feel free to send us your questions. They can be for all panelists or to a specific organization. I'm looking out for them. If we cannot get to all of them, I promise you we will find a way to address them. So send them over. Okay, Joe, this first question goes out to you at Organization for Community Development. You've spoken with us about your partnership with Firelight Foundation, one of the organizations featured in our report. The incredible amount of trust that you share in this relationship and how flexible funding as well as capacity building grants can make a huge difference even when they are much smaller than big programmatic grants. But I wondered, in this moment of time, from the perspective of a grassroots organization, how has your organization had to adjust to address COVID-19? And what role, if any, has flexible funding played in this adjustment? Joe?
Thank you very much, Swati, and hi to all panelists. Actually, the role of flexible funding cannot be overemphasized. Here in Tanzania, where we are really working at the grassroots level. And we are working in the community of less economically privileged communities, where resources and everything is very scarce and a lot of challenges. And in the middle of implementing programs, and then it comes this challenge of COVID-19. Started slowly, and but by the time now, it's a huge challenge, and everyone is looking out to address it. It has totally changed the way we live and the way we work as organizations, because most of the program now have to stop because the government is taking measures to ensure the spread of this disease is contained. So for us as an organization, because we are working with the two components, we are working on capacity building for the actors we are working with, but also we are working on infrastructure development for the school to enable our children to have access to education at the school. Now you find at this time, all the capacity building to our actors have almost stopped because we don't require any gathering, schools are closed, and then there is no any training you can do, there is no meeting, there is no mobilization you can do in the community, so everything has stopped. And as an organization now to adjust to this, because now we need to adapt to a new way of living and working. As an organization, we used to come to office, to work from here at the office and to go to the field. But now you find it's very difficult now to go into the field to work. But also coming to office is very also challenging owing to the transport problem we are having, because here we are using public transport, which are very congested and a lot of traffic on jam. So with this disease, it's really terrible and it's really challenging. So we had to opt to work from home. And how do we work from home as a staff? We needed now to ensure that we have facilities at the home of each staff to be able to communicate, to ensure we have internet access. So we had to look for the technician to go to every staff's home to ensure we can put at least a reliable access to the internet to allow our communication and the meeting to continue. And to do that, actually, you need funds. And then the fund you have in other programs, they are very problematic, very rigid. You cannot get the access. So in order to address this, we have this small fund on the flexible funding that now has allowed us to be able to do these things to allow the organization to keep going. But again, at the community level, there are things of necessity is for now that we are not in our programs. You need to create awareness for the disease. You need to have hand wash basin in public areas. You need to ensure the children are at home, because now the schools are closed. But when they are at home, the parents are not there. They need to be assisted. So we don't have funding for this in the program because the program are very rigid. But with the flexible funding now, it allows us now to address these issues of emergence that has come up. So you find that we remain relevant to the community because of this flexible funding. But if there is no flexible funding, we become irrelevant because everything has stopped, and then you continue the program, which are not which have stopped for now. So this is how we are adjusting. But again, now we are asking other funders to look at these programs, because you have the program which already 3 years program. You have the budget for 3 years. Now in the middle of this, you need things to change. So we are talking to our funders to see if possible, we can use some of the portion of the fund to address the current need in order to move from this time, and then when things have stabilized, and then you can go to the normal program. And we are lucky that some of the funders, of course, have trusted us, and then they have allowed us to use 5% of the programmatic fund in order to address these challenges of the community. So actually, the flexible funding, I would say it gives a ventilation. When you have these problems, and then you have something that you did not forecast, and then they're coming in, and then this, it's really of help.
Thank you, Joseph, for sharing these insights. So let's let that sink in for a second. The closing of schools around the world has affected the work of so many organizations that work in the education and livelihood sector. It has the potential to paralyze the impact as well as the operations of organizations such as yours. And flexible funding can help avoid this paralysis. And where you don't have flexible funding, and I can relate with this as well, that organizations are spending valuable time speaking with donors to convert that restricted funding into unrestricted funding. So I empathize, I feel you, and thank you so much for sharing that grassroots insight, Joseph. We will come back to you in a little bit. Let's go to Maury Ingram from Whatcom Community Foundation. Maury, you are the executive director at Whatcom Community Foundation, and you're a fundraiser as well as a grant maker, so you're privy to both perspectives. And you shared with me that a few years ago, the foundation received a very large long-term flexible grant from one of your key donors. You mentioned that this funding continues to shape what we are becoming, and like Joseph mentioned, how this infusion of trust capital has enabled you to pivot during this emergency. You also shared something with me that really stood out to me, that flexible funding can shift the decision-making power from donors to communities, with a great example of supporting needs of an immigrant community in Whatcom County. Could you share that example with our audience today, and what relationship that example has with flexible funding?
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. Several years ago, we had an immigration raid that affected almost 20 families in our community. And so in response to that, we set up an immigration relief fund. And the goal was, of course, to make funds available to help with housing costs, food security, medical expenses, transportation, and then, of course, legal expenses. And at a time when so much was completely out of control for all of these families, we saw a number of really exciting things happen. We worked with a couple of intermediary organizations to get money out to the families. And as a part of that group of families that was affected, 2 women emerged very organically as natural leaders. And they played a key role in organizing the families and in helping to navigate the resources that were going to be available and just the systems that they were going to have to interact with. And this was completely out of their comfort zone, work that they had never done before. And what was so amazing about the opportunity was that rather than setting up a formula or prescriptive criteria that was going to dictate how the monies would be distributed, the women were able to work directly with their peer families in determining how those monies were going to be spent and who would be prioritized based on their circumstance. So at a time, again, when so much was upended and out of their control, this really gave an incredible level of agency to families. And I think one of the things that I found particularly powerful was that, not surprisingly, most of these immigrant families, actually all of them, none of them had actually heard of our community foundation or any community foundation. So the message of trust that was sent was not even the idea that an organization was placing trust in them. It was really that all of the people who contributed to the fund, and by extension, the community, actually believed in them. And one of the ways that really manifests itself for the 2 women who emerged organically as leaders is that they've now stepped into far bigger leadership roles in their own community and in the broader community as a result. And while I would not ascribe the trust-based funding or the flexible funding to their incredible capacity and their natural leadership skills, I do believe that it played some small role in helping to bring them into a place in their community that has helped them become real leaders and activists for the immigrant community in Whatcom County.
Maury, I love this example. It really shows how solutions lie within the communities, and the whole point of funding is to enable those solutions. So it really speaks to me. So thank you for sharing this example and this insight. Since you're dual-hatted, tell us a little bit about how funders benefit from flexible funding.
There are a variety of benefits from our perspective. First of all, we always go into any grant-making relationship with some sort of idea about what we hope to see happen. And what's so wonderful about flexible funding is that we get so much more than we ever hoped for. We learn so much beyond whatever we walked in, either aspiring to or expecting. And in addition to that, we've also seen a tremendous amount of opportunity for our own organizational capacity building. We've seen the approaches that some of our grantees take in terms of learning about how to be better partners in the communities that they work in and identify all kinds of other strategies. One example I would share is that a local grantee that works in the healthcare system decided to employ a human-centered design approach in reimagining their service delivery. And they too, like many of us, went in expecting that they knew what they were going to hear from their client population. And instead, they found all kinds of new ways to better serve and connect their patients.
This is really helpful. Thank you so, so much. I see a question from the audience about measurement, evaluation, and learning. A shout out to Ritu B. Nanda for posing this question, and we are getting to it. Let's go to Corey Ozer, the VP of Programs at Global Fund for Children. Corey, as a grant maker, GFC has a very international footprint, and you've shared with us that flexible funding is a fundamental aspect of how GFC operates, and it's incorporated in your theory of change even, especially for grassroots organizations. So connecting it to the question that's coming from our audience, in extending this type of support, how do you measure the success of flexible funding? How do you align on outcomes, reportings, metrics with your grantees? Tell us a little bit more, especially given this moment in time, but also in general. How do you measure the success of flexible funding?
Thank you. So at Global Fund for Children, we believe it's really important for organizations to identify the ways that they think are most relevant to measure success. They know their communities, they know the work, they know what they're trying to achieve. And as a funder, we can nudge them, we can act as a sounding board and a resource, but ultimately we feel it's up to them to define success. And we really want to hear from our partners what outcomes make sense to them. We're interested in seeing their outcomes and seeing how they track change over time, but we don't want to tell them what to measure. And as we're typically investing in the whole organization and their ability to make change that affects the lives of children and youth in their communities, we want to know things like, how are they adapting to new circumstances? So the story that Joseph shared is a great example of one organization adapting to changing circumstances. So we want to know from our partners, how are they learning? How are they adapting to complexity? How is their leadership evolving? What changes are they making across their organization? Are they making progress on their self-identified priorities for strengthening their capacity as an organization? Especially because we work with child and youth focused organizations, we're interested to know things like, are young people included more in decision-making and structures in the organization? Is there more of attention to safeguarding of children? Are there shifts that they're seeing as an organization toward more positive power? So those are some of the areas that we're really interested in learning together with our partners. And ultimately, we believe that organizations should spend less time reporting and more time actually doing the work. And we want to make reporting a meaningful, reflective process and not a check the box exercise. So by having qualitative questions, by encouraging organizations to take a step back to reflect on some of the areas that I talked about, we feel that that can be a useful tool for them as they reflect on their journey and their evolution as an organization. And we also think it's important to invest in capacity development around monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And again, not for a specific project necessarily, but as a whole, because we think there's real benefit to organizations in being able to better articulate the changes that they're hoping for and the changes that they're seeing, and to approach those changes in creative ways. But often they need the tools and the resources to be able to do that. So as a funder, to invest in some of these efforts, we think that that's an important role that we can play.
Thank you for sharing that. And as a funder, you are clearly invested and you're clearly seeing the value from flexible funding. From a funder perspective, do you think are you hearing a call, or do you think there's a call to shift all funding to become flexible and swing the pendulum all the way to the other side? Or is there some sort of mix between flexible and restricted or something else that we as a sector or even our people in our audience should be aiming for?
I think there isn't a magic formula, but there is a real call to make a more radical shift to more flexible funding overall, to really believe and support the work that's defined, especially by community-based organizations. Unfortunately, I think there's been there has been movement in the sector. I think there can be much more, but there are initiatives around, say, the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project through the Whitman Institute that's looking at principles of grant making, especially one of those being flexible funding. There's the Shift the Power campaign that's connected through the Global Fund for the Community Foundations. There's major foundations such as Ford Foundation that have taken very public steps toward allocating more of their resources toward flexible funding. There are funder collaboratives like the Women for Girls Collective that are geared toward this effort. So I think there's real movement coming from different pockets in the sector, and I think that's really exciting to see. And I think together with some of these efforts, it's important to identify where we can have the most influence. And I think that a lot of that can be in private philanthropy, to encourage foundations to reflect on their practices and reflect on how they can make a shift, maybe not all of their funding, but a significant part of their funding toward more flexibility.
That's an interesting point, that we're not saying that all funding always needs to be flexible, but that the pendulum is so far on one side that a radical shift is needed to bring it to the center or wherever it is that ideal mix might be for an organization or a funder or society in general. Thank you so much for sharing that perspective with us. Let's go to Career Ready, where we have the Chief Operating Officer, Mark Smith. Mark, Career Ready connects youth in disadvantaged communities to the world of work in the United Kingdom. And your model of working has also been through schools, which, like Joseph was saying, has probably upended and disrupted by the pandemic. Tell us how Career Ready is innovating at this time of crisis, and what role does general operating support, flexible funding, if any, has played in enabling your response?
Thank you, Swati, and hello from the UK to everybody on the call. It hasn't so much upended what we do as effectively stopped everything we do. We triangulate between schools, young people and employers. And with the schools closed, with employers effectively stopping their staff from volunteering, from allowing young people to come into the workplace either for internships or work experience or visits. You know, a large chunk, if not virtually everything that we had been doing for 18 years had stopped. So we asked ourselves a set of questions very early on in the pandemic, and to say, look, do we just throw a sheet over ourselves and go and hibernate for a few months and come back in the autumn or the winter? And immediately we said, no, we exist to make a difference. We exist to try and change and inspire young people to realize their talent. So the pandemic shouldn't stop that. So in the space of 3 weeks, we revisited all our materials, all our content, all our program delivery channels to see what could be digitized, what could be moved online. So we were on, the team responded really, really quickly, to be honest. I mean, I've never been prouder of, in any leadership role I've ever had, to the way that the team responded so quickly to evaluate the materials we had, whether they fit for purpose, how could they be changed, and to kind of engage with the schools and the young people so that we had direct communication with them. And our employer supporters and the volunteers we have been superb, responding really quickly to new ways of working, new digital platforms. It's been fabulous and an incredibly proud moment. But to come back to your question about the role and that flexible funding plays, none of it would have been possible without access to some money, because everything that we do had to stop, and you don't have the time to go out to all your funders and say, by the way, we're going to do this, because that would have taken too long to get answers. We don't have the time to make funding applications to crisis funds, because we're not at the front line of medical service provision. So we load down anyone's list to get emergency funding for this stuff. So we did it because it needed doing, and we had access to flexible funding. And if we hadn't had the access, there's a very strong chance we would not have been able to function at all.
Yeah, this is so interesting. Kind of just collating some of the sound bites from all of the panelists, Mark, that flexible funding has enabled you to innovate. During a time of necessity, it has been critical to be able to adjust during this pandemic, or even if the shift was needed for some other reason. That shift is enabled by flexible funding, and there's a clear case to increase the ratio of flexible funding to restricted. So I would love to ask this to all our panelists, starting with you, Mark, that if there's such a case for flexible funding, and yet we are seeing that this is not yet a norm, it's still very small in dollar amounts, and yet it has outsized impact. Why is this not a norm yet? Why is flexible funding continuing to be such a rare commodity? And just kind of talking directly to our audience, who can change that and how?
I mean, I'd like to pick up on the point there about who can change it. I think we've all got a role to play in how systemic change, lasting change is made. I think from the sector, from the voluntary sector, the non-profit, we have to be beyond reproach. We have to give absolute confidence in the people who give us their funding, their money, to do what we say we're going to do it in the most professional way we possibly can. That will generate trust, and that trust needs to be earned over time. And that's something that someone said right at the top of this. This is earned. It's about partnership and how you kind of build a deep mutual understanding from the funder in what makes a difference to us, and we understand what the funders need, be it from reporting, either an impact assessment or regular reporting, whatever it is. So I think it really does. And I think this is one of the questions I saw pop up, is around trust and how you generate that. And I think why possibly it's not there yet is that actually it takes a lot of bravery from a funder to move early in this and to say they're going to do it. And yes, there are trusts and foundations in the UK that have been very public about supporting funding of this sort. And I think it takes confidence, and people will have increased confidence when they see others moving, and that kind of pack mentality takes over. But it takes bravery from the funder, because they are accountable, be it to shareholders or to whoever else. So we have to generate trust, and we have to be able to work in a more long-term basis. And I think this, to me, is something I've been reflecting a lot over the last 48 hours, is the real benefit of deep long-term partnerships and relationships between the people who are providing the funding and the people who are doing the work. And I think that, to me, gives you the opportunity to move beyond just a project timeline and work to an organizational timeline and the cyclical nature of what organizations do. So that would be my take on it.
Interesting to see nonprofits taking the onus to earn the trust. How about a funder perspective? Corey, why do you think that flexible funding continues to be a rare commodity, and who can change that and how?
I think one thing that's important for funders to be able to do is to be comfortable with the idea that they are contributing to change, especially the long-term social, political, economic change that Mark was alluding to, and not trying to specifically attribute changes only to their specific pot of money, but to see their efforts more collectively with other funders in contributing to the longer term visions for change that the organizations that they're supporting have. I think there has been a bit of an attachment to being able to trace and track the very specific outcomes from the funds that you give to one organization, and that has led us down the road of looking at very specific deliverables and outputs as opposed to longer term outcomes and impact of change. So I think that that shift in approach and that being comfortable with a more collective approach will be important for funders. And again, I think it's important that funders, particularly those with visibility and influence, take steps, as some, as I mentioned, have already done and are very public about why they're taking these steps and what they're learning in the process, and that we can really share stories, some of the kinds of powerful stories that we're hearing in this conversation today about what difference this kind of funding has meant for organizations, and be able to tell those stories in more creative ways.
Yeah, so sharing is important, and sharing your experience can amplify the impact of what you're doing. So if you're somebody who's extending flexible support and it is proving valuable, share those stories and influence others. Absolutely, it's a great funder perspective. Maury, how about you? You have a dual-headed perspective. Why do you think flexible funding is a rare commodity, and who can change that and how?
Well, I think there are a few things at play, a lot of longstanding beliefs and practices in the field of philanthropy, and I think a lot of that comes from Western culture. We've often used metrics like achievement and the accumulation of wealth as ways to define ourselves and as drivers for a lot of our decision making. And I think, and of course in the US particularly, we've often had a pretty unhealthy relationship with money. And we have a very, I think, rigid definition of what we mean by stewardship when we think about philanthropic resources. And so I think a big part of what we can do as funders is to reclaim the territory around defining stewardship and truly articulating what that means, that we're not just stewarding or shepherding or even hoarding resources. And we also don't have to actually know what the outcomes are going to be. If all of this work that we're supporting was easy, everyone would be doing it and more of the problems in the world would be solved. And yet we do have an opportunity to really highlight that whether we're private philanthropists or individuals or we're community foundations, we have some sort of mission, articulated or not, that we're really trying to hold ourselves to some greater aspiration. And in order to do that, we need to take risk with the money, and trust is a key part of that. So I think making sure that we're leading by, again, redefining the perception around the idea of stewardship, and this question around how do you build trust. And I often recall a colleague telling me when I was asking her how to work with a community that we didn't have a relationship with, and he said, well, I would encourage you to do what they want to do before you ask them to do what you want to do. And that's proven incredibly valuable for us. And I think lastly, I would say that we hear more and more very happily in the field of philanthropy that we believe that solutions live in communities. And if we truly believe that, then we actually need to give the power of the purse to those communities so that they can act in the way that they know is best.
I love that. The solutions live in the community. Thank you so much for sharing your insight. And let's go to a grassroots perspective. Joseph, how about you? Why do you think this is a rare commodity, when I think you've shared with us before that even small amounts of flexible funding can have outsized impacts, and you're seeing those impacts play out during this time of transition? So why do you think this still remains a rare commodity, and who can change it for you, for the sector, and how? Joseph? I think you might be on mute.
if you can, yes.
Yes.
Yes, thank you, Swati. Actually, there are things from my perspective as I've been working in these organizations. It's a rare commodity because we're talking about trust. There is a little trust between funders and those who receive fund. And of course, there are factors that is causing that. This lies on part of those who are being supported, but there are those also which lie in from the funders. And then there is this issue of accountability. You need to account for every dollar that you receive. And for the funding organization, they need to account for that because they are receiving fund and then these funds are channeled to this organization. But at the end of the day, they needed to show the result, the accountability of that. So this one causes what I say, you need to have a trust in order to allow a large amount of fund to get into flexibility, to be flexible, so that the organization can work and then can account to that and to show the result of that one. So there is that one. But also, I think there is this notion of quick result. Sometimes funders need quick result. And that's why you may find even a program a short time, So in order for the quick result, and then you need it to be very structured in such a way that you're sure that this time and then you get the result. So that one also can be one of the factors. But also, I think another issue is on the solution for the community programs. Sometimes you find the funders, they already have the solutions in mind, and then they don't trust the solution to come from the community themselves. And that's one contribute to this very rigid funding that this is the solution and then you need to work on this and then you come up with the result. But you don't trust the organization to work with the community and to come with the result. So that's the things also I would quickly point out. But also, I think the issue of transparency. Sometimes you find no transparency in both sides, the funders and those who are receiving funds.
Right.
You don't know what to expect. So everyone is operating on end. So I think that might be the reason why this flexible funding is becoming very rare. And you can see, of course, now there is much appreciation of the capacity building, general support, building the organization, the skills of the organization. I think after building the skills of the organizations, and then it can be another time to learn and then trust. Once now the organization have the capacity and then you can trust and then allow for flexible funding.
Yeah.
So I think that's what I can say from the grassroots level.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Transparency and trust go both ways. And I see a few questions in the Q&A panel or side of the screen coming up about both perception and trust. And it goes both ways. How many times are we sitting in our own silo or our own organization trying to guess what the funder wants us to say or do, and vice versa? Right, so that relationship building has to happen from both ends. And I want to tease out something that you said, Joseph, that we talked at length yesterday at the dry run, that there's been a premise in philanthropy that I want to see my dollar travel, and that I almost want to see visually where it goes and how it moves through into the communities and ends with impact. And here we are challenging that premise that you don't need that straight line or that visual. That flexible funding doesn't give you that visual. But what it does is it provides you with outsized impact. It provides you with your grantees to have the flexibility to pivot, to build, to innovate. So that's a very interesting kind of way that we're challenging one of the old tenets of philanthropy itself. So thank you so much for sharing that perspective. Folks, I see a number of really amazing questions coming through. Please keep them coming. We do have time to expound on one or two more, and we promise we will online or somehow we will address them. Folks, what would you say in a minute or two, our panelists, what would you say to funders on the line who are buying into the case for flexible funding, but might have apprehensions or barriers about taking the leap into fully flexible funding or majority flexible funding? What would you say to them? So let's go back this way. So Joseph, how about you? In a minute or two.
Yes. Actually, what I would say is for the funders, trust in the power of the community first. After trusting in the power of the community to bring change for the problem that they have, and then work with the organization that works with that community. And from working with those organizations, building the capacities of how to work and how to mobilize their communities, and then build the trust. Because we are talking about trust, but trust is something that you need to build. It's not a one way that one day and then you come with that trust. You need to start at a certain point, and then from there you build that trust. And I will give you an example of where we started with I'm talking about Firelight Foundation. It's now 60 years partnership. But the way we started, it was very, very small, just an entry point. We started like a project, a small project. But from within the small project, and then we opened up our discussions, talking together, talking to the communities, working together. And from there, now you really see, okay, this organization is really doing. And actually, it's really struggling, and it's addressing the real need of the communities. And slow by slow, the trust comes. Next year, third year, fourth year, to the point now where we are. So I would say we need to balance, of course. For me, of course, you cannot channel all the fund for the flexible funding, but we can go gradually, increase a little by little.
Yeah.
You have a program, you have organizational support, and then you have flexible funding. So you continue investing and increasing ratio by ratio. But to be honest, if you have a lot for flexible funding, we can really address the real problems of the community.
Yeah. No, these are great points, Joseph, that start somewhere, start small, start today, start with partners that you know, and then expand on it. Wonderful perspective. Thank you so much. Maury, how about you? What would you say to our funders in the audience?
Well, I would echo Joseph's comments. And then in addition to that, I would say we work with a consultant team that often gives the example of holding things either tightly with a closed hand or holding them with an open hand. And I think in philanthropy, we've often had a closed hand. And so this is something that people should lean into and embark on with an open hand. Don't set a lot of expectations. And then the other thing I would say is to reach out to those of us either on the panel or appear in other places in the report as resources, because I know that I would absolutely be thrilled to talk with a funder who has questions so that you can ask all those awkward questions that you might not want to ask in a public setting in order to increase your comfort level.
Yeah. Do your philanthropy with open hands, not with closed hands. I love it. And folks, if you do have awkward questions, if you do have questions that you don't want to ask in a public forum, send them to us and we will address them along with the panelists. Corey, let's go to you. And for you, I have a different question that was posed by an audience that I think you are well positioned to address. And the question is that recognizing that most government development agencies fund projects through taxpayer money, and I know we've spoken about this a little bit before, and taxpayer money and these development agencies, for them, the process of accessing these funds is extra tedious and challenging for implementing organizations. due to the government's duty of accountability and transparency to their constituents. So that visual of following your dollar really comes to life with government agency philanthropy, but that is also where scale is. So how do you see them transforming into providing flexible funding, or how do you even bring them into this conversation?
I think there are some government funding mechanisms that have invested in or are investing in capacity development for organizations, in different kinds of learning mechanisms, like the outcome harvesting example that was mentioned at the beginning. So I think there are pockets where there is some innovation and some experimentation. So I think it's important to identify where those are, but also really to bring governments, to bring public funding into this dialogue. I think a lot of these conversations have been had largely with private funders. So to be able to have those conversations and really to see where are the barriers, how far can change go within the confinement that maybe some public funding has. Is there room for shift? In some cases, is there room for experimentation? But I think having that conversation, bringing public and private funders together to learn from each other, is an important point to see where there are some shifts, because I think it is possible, even within the structures that exist, to make some of those shifts, and to identify what those can be a powerful step.
So there is still that big step of bringing these folks into the conversation. And I want to go back to a point that that was made earlier, that use your influence, that even if your dollar numbers are smaller, by the virtue of seeing the value in it and sharing this experience and bringing others into the conversation, that is sort of how collective action and collective impact and scale is possible. So I really appreciate your perspective. And Mark, I have a different question for you, actually, that is coming from our audience, that I think a data-driven guy like you would be well-positioned to address. What type of data-driven efforts are being held together for flexible funding? What type of measurement, learning, evaluation are you seeing? And you spoke a little bit about earning that long-term trust. So in terms of measurement, evaluation, and data-driven efforts, how do you connect that with showing the success of flexible funding?
It's a really good question. Just a little bit of context, just for like a moment of context. The program content that we delivered historically, we built entire databases and ecosystems to be able to take care of inputs and outputs, and it was very sophisticated when it was first built. But the changes to the newer interventions that we were delivering meant we needed new metrics, new software. So we've done a whole piece of development work to try and give us the tools we need now, not the ones that we needed in the past. And so that data for us has been able to tell a kind of a richer, deeper story. It's not, so even though we've tried to pivot to do everything online, we're still working with the same young people, we're still working with the same volunteers, we're still working with the same schools. So the data points from that point of view are the same. It's just the delivery mechanics and the channels have changed. So for us, we've been able, with our new data gathering, to talk a much richer, deeper story about the backgrounds of the people who volunteer with us, for example. You know, how closely aligned are they to the sorts of young people we're now supporting and mentoring? So the profile of the young people that we're working with, you know, how disadvantaged are they on that spectrum? And, you know, do you have very affluent areas, but within those affluent areas, you've got families that are going on, you know, really struggling. And, you know, just because they're in an affluent area, they don't necessarily get all the help they would do normally. So actually for us to be able to generate and capture a lot of very dry data points when people register with us, we've then been able to tell a much richer story in terms of broader societal impact to the work we do. So we try to move beyond just the sense of, oh, look, 80% of people came from this background, or 98% of the young people went on to achieve a positive destination. We've been able to talk a bit more about where they've come from, what some of the barriers have been, in a much richer, more narrative state. So data just enriches the story. And actually, from the funder's point of view, when we're able to tell a much deeper story, yes, it's underpinned by data because it has to be, but you bring it to life with the individual and the emotional, and that really works. But oddly enough, just to cycle back momentarily, if I may, the build for all of that work we had to get from unrestricted funding, flexible funding, because we needed to build that material and that software and that package, and it would have just taken too long to get grants specific to that. Some have come on stream now, but there's the great irony: to be able to tell that story, we had to have the unrestricted funding in the first place to build the tools.
Yeah, and we've covered so much through these perspectives. We've covered the role of flexible funding in innovation, in sparking innovation and continuing innovation, in pivoting to meet the changing needs of our communities, pivoting during a crisis like this, to continue making impact, to foster collaboration, to shift the power dynamic away from the source of funding to the source of impact into the communities. And there's a clear case for shifting the needle, moving the needle towards more flexible funding, although we are not making the case that all funding needs to be flexible, but we do need to start and change that ratio today. So folks, I could listen to you all day. I've learned so much from your perspectives. The questions are amazing. We have several more questions about impact investing, sustainability, impact measurement, green checks, all sorts of stuff. And I promise you, we will get to them. This does conclude our session for today. The conversation on funding from a place of trust, however, is poised to reach its height, given the moment that we are in and given the momentum this topic is in. So we invite you to join and take it back to your organizations, take it back to your work. This session and the report were made possible by support from Citi Foundation, and this webinar is a critical part of a series at Synergos on building trust and cultivating action. I saw a number of questions. I saw a lot of interest from the audience. Join us. We will be sending a follow-up email after this session where you can find the report as well as information on becoming part of this conversation. It's so important, it's so timely, and it's very enduring. It will stay on after we emerge out of this crisis. So thank you so much for joining our conversation again on funding from a place of trust. Thank you, be safe, be healthy, be kind, and hope to see you again very soon.